The whole point of really truly understanding motivation is to use it as reinforcement. Like that's the whole thing. It's really nice to understand like what makes a dog tick. And as I said, like for me, the very first thing I want to do whenever I'm interacting with the dog is understand those things. I want to understand the dog's motivations, not just in regards to like why, like what does it like and how can I leverage those things, but why is it doing the things that it is doing? What is its motivation? Because we understood yesterday, like dogs are just motivated to move away from something that they find bad, aversive, like let's replace that word bad with aversive, and towards something that they find good. And let's replace, good with like appetitive. So it doesn't necessarily need to be obvious to us what those things are, bad versus good, and every dog will sort of see that differently. And we identify that really quick, like your husky, any amount of pressure you're concerned about that it could really, shut the dog down, and we're only using slight pressure, you got the neck tech on, it's a bit of a, like we're treading carefully. And then we've got Lucian that's like, oh, choke me harder, right? So like it's not that like any particular collar or use of it or style is inherently aversive to the dog. It's that the dog, it's how they feel about anything in particular. And it's not that, again, your dog's a great example of it. Like food doesn't exactly seem like something that the dog wants, whereas other dogs are, biting the hand to get it. So it's it's not that food good, collar bad. It's every dog's an individual. And then when we talk behavior, rather than just like how we're going to leverage that to teach the dog something, when the dog comes out and is doing things like the little Aussie, we can then say like, why is this happening? Like, what is your motivation to behave in the way that you are? So we look at it from two angles. One, how do I leverage the motivation of this dog to get the behaviors that I want? And the other, why is the dog, like what motivations are driving the dog to do the things that it's already doing? And really that's dog training, right? Like that's the whole thing. We unpack that, use what we want, identify what's already happening and change it to suit our needs. So talking about motivation, yesterday we said like bad to good. Today we're going to sort of cross those out and make this like away and towards. So when we then start talking about reinforcement, negative reinforcement will push the dog into a behavior because the dog wants to move away from it. And positive reinforcement will pull the dog out of the behavior but make it more likely to happen. And I think that's the way that we like can separate the types of reinforcement. So it's interesting at the moment, there's some push in the literature to be rid of Skinner's language that he left us with, because in the real world it doesn't serve us as well as it served him in his laboratory. And sometimes it can be very, very difficult to distinguish the difference between negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement, especially in instances where, what am I doing? Positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is often very easy to identify, and you can say it's definitely negative reinforcement and there's no positive reinforcement component sometimes. But often with positive reinforcement, can be really hard to say like, yes, for sure, that's guaranteed positive reinforcement. And the thing is like food and, classic just sort of click and give him a treat type training is what we usually refer to as the most obvious glaring example of purely positive reinforcement. But the issue is, in order for you to want something, so remember we say like positive reinforcement is to add a thing that makes it more likely. In order for you to want something, you have to have a place to put that, right? Something has to be missing for you to put it in. So in order for food training to work, if you're going to give the dog food, you're probably removing a level of hunger that exists in the dog. And so the truth is, it's really difficult to say for sure, I'm just using positive reinforcement. every application of positive reinforcement has to satiate something. It has to fill a need. The dog has to need it, and therefore the desire of needing it, the hunger to want it, could be categorized as negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement sort of can be a little bit more standing alone by itself, right? Because a dog could feel great and want for nothing, but then I can apply a pressure and then that will motivate him to do something. But even then, the application, I have to apply something in order to take something away, right? So they're hard to think of in the language that Skinner gave us. And what we really end up having is two types of reinforcement that can be categorized better as one that can make something happen, right? Can make something happen, and one that can make something happen again. So negative reinforcement can make something happen now because I can drive the dog into the behavior with negative reinforcement. And when the dog is in the behavior, it's positive reinforcement that can make him want to do it again. And that becomes, I think, the better way to think about how to distinguish between negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. Not so much about like, what tool am I using, what reinforcer am I using? It's that, is it going to make it happen? Or is it going to make it happen again next time? That's one of the biggest issues of people who try to just use this type of reinforcement, is that it has to have already happened, right? It has to have already happened in order to make it more likely to happen. And that's why this type of training, it's one of the reasons that this type of training can be slower. If you're going to go with purely positive type training, positive reinforcement as much as possible, there has to be some way of getting the dog to bring it on. And if he doesn't want to and he doesn't feel like it, and if your motivation isn't as high as it could be, or just the peculiar behavior that you're trying to bring on, like there's many, many reasons why it's a little bit more difficult to use. But the stark reality is that it has to have already happened in one way or another for you to get it to happen again, whereas in this way we can make it happen. The trick then is obviously we use both, and that's, Nipopo. And that we say Nipopo like that's Bart's word, literally, he owns the word. He copyrighted it. But it's just a way of explaining that it's negative reinforcement into the behavior and positive reinforcement out of the behavior. If you can bring on the behavior with a correction, it has to be Nipopo. Because the truth is, if you ask a dog to do something and it doesn't do it, and then you apply a pressure and it does do it, the only way for that to happen is if there was pressure in a learning phase. Because if I teach my dog to sit, and he knows it, and then I one day ask him to, and I've only used positive reinforcement, and I one day ask him to sit, and then he doesn't, and I give him a correction, I can't give him a correction physically because he doesn't know what to do with that pressure. That pressure is not like, it's new to him in that moment. And if in that moment I do use pressure until he does sit in what people would say, no, I didn't have a learning phase of pressure, like Nipopo style, I just taught him, and then when he didn't do it, I made him. Well, you are, because now this is your first rep of this. Because then when he does it, you're going to reinforce him out of it, and you're in that system immediately. So there isn't a way to avoid it if you're doing successful training. It's the only way that it happens. That's the science, like that's the puzzle and how it fits together. Where people go super wrong with this is that, if you remember, we talked about how with positive reinforcement, to bring reliability in a behavior, you're going to need a lot more repetitions than you're going to need in negative reinforcement. Everybody sort of agrees with that, right? Much more repetitions in positive reinforcement than in negative reinforcement. But the truth is, those are the observable repetitions of the application or the removal of the pressure, right? The observable ones. Because that study that I could never find, they claim that it says 400 to 600 repetitions to have 100% reliable behavior using negative reinforcement, and 4,000 to 6,000 repetitions to have 100% reliable behavior using positive reinforcement. But the thing is, with negative reinforcement, every repetition includes negative reinforcement. Because if the dog thinks that he escapes pressure, via doing the behavior and then avoids pressure by doing the behavior, every time he does it and there is no pressure, negative reinforcement was in effect. He got away from the bad thing, the thing that motivates him, the aversive that was driving him forward. He didn't escape it, he beat it. And even if you had no intention to put it on, it still was beaten. And that's why behaviors taught with negative reinforcement are more persistent. They're less prone to extinction. And they're probably actually like the exact same amount prone to extinction, only when you're not doing anything, you still are doing this. Because if the pressure didn't come, even if you had no way or intention of putting it on, the dog can't necessarily know that, and therefore he thinks he beat it and did the right thing and continues, he feels reinforced. So we're gonna today start playing with this, and the reason why this is such an amazing system, and it's why all successful dog trainers are using it, whether they sort of want to acknowledge that or not, in one way or another this is happening, is because it's so clear when we're driving behavior in and we're reinforcing for that this is the correct moment. It becomes super clear to the dog, like what I'm doing here, and this is our target behavior, right? It's super clear to the dog. And when I see people trying as hard as they can to not use any negative reinforcement, what it comes at is the cost of clarity to the dog. We see that because the dog can only know this was right because I'm trying to do it again, but he doesn't have any information about what's happening here. We haven't provided him any feedback. So, it's interesting to me because a lot of the force-free people are the ones that talk about how the critical importance of timing and all this kind of stuff, but they don't understand that like all of this timing is important. The timing prior to the behavior is super important, not just the timing at the time of the behavior. Because it's hard for the dog to understand, like when you click, was that for what's happening right now, and how much prior to the click is involved in being correct. Whereas using negative reinforcement, the dog understands exactly. While the pressure is on, I'm still searching. When the pressure comes off, I am correct. This helps me to learn what to do, and then I am doing the right thing. And then this tells me, yes, confirms, yes, you were, makes me more likely to do it. So negative reinforcement drives into the behavior, positive reinforcement pulls out of the behavior. Do we see a lot of people shutting their dogs down quite a lot when they do this system? Shutting them down and making the dogs sort of disinterested in the training. We do for sure, and it's because they go with negative reinforcement way too often. And the thing that is critical to understand is that you're using negative reinforcement on every rep. You are, but the way to use negative reinforcement on every rep is to sometimes not apply the pressure and have the dog assume that they avoided it. So is it in effect all the time? Yes, absolutely it's in effect all the time, but that doesn't mean you should apply it with every rep. And the thing is as well, if you use negative reinforcement, if you hit the button or hit the leash or whatever every single time, even like as that, once it becomes the tap that acts as a reinforcer of the command, if you do that every single time, it loses its property as escape and avoidance, because if there is no avoid, it's only escape, right? And that's when the dog's like, fucking hell, I have to do this every single time. Even worse than that is when people put on the negative reinforcement through the behavior and then take it off at the same time there. And the big risk in that is that we create learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is a motherfucker of a thing. There's various levels of it. The original study about how they sort of identified it is incredible, because it's one of those ones that they uncovered by accident, trying to prepare a dog for something else. Is anybody familiar with it? Anyone seen the video? It's brutal. And so that's what we see when people don't turn off the negative reinforcement. The best case is that the negative reinforcement isn't very motivating to the dog, and the dog's just like, fuck it, this is my life, I just endure this pressure. And a pressure from which there is no escape is abuse, right? This is the issue, is that like the people that we encounter in the dog training world that are really anti any use of pressure and can't for the life of them imagine how it could be used motivationally. In my experience, they usually have come to that way of thinking in two ways. One is, and this is the less likely, but still common enough. One is that if they were to use pressure, that's how they would use it, right? They would imagine themselves using it that way. The other is that's how pressure was used on them. So like a lot of people who had like abusive childhoods, whatever, were put under pressure from which there was no escape. And that's just abuse. It's not a learning, it's not manipulative, it's just abuse. When I was in the army, in a special forces unit, like discipline works kind of differently. We're still harbored by the same military rules, but like people are there to do their job. So like people, it's not that discipline works differently, it's just people tend not to get in trouble at all. And long story, I won't bother going through it all, but a guy who was a friend of mine, when I was his platoon sergeant, I told him not to do something and he did it. And it wasn't a big deal, but I said to him, I said, mate, the problem with this is, like I specifically told you not to do it. Given the set of circumstances, I may have made the same decision as you. But the problem is I specifically told you not to. You did it anyway. The only reason the whole army works is because we have a linear rank structure and you have to do what I say. You chose not to, so I have to punish you. So I decided to like formally charge him, which is like, go through the proper army discipline system. And it goes to, like, he's meant to be charged, and my intent was that he would lose like a day's pay or something that would just be a minor kick in the dick that he would be like, okay, I paid a consequence. It didn't have to be that bad, but he had to pay something. And what ended up happening, it went to the CSM, and they chose not to charge him, but they DO'd him to different thing. But essentially, he got 3 days of extras, and it was a long weekend, like 3-day weekend, and our CSM at the time was like mid-divorce and lived on the base. And so this guy had to spend 3 days doing shit jobs when we were all away, right? Cleaning gutters, doing dumb shit, washing cars, all the things that like just wasted 3 of his days. And I was like, yep, I'm fine with that, no problem. But then on the Tuesday when we come into work, there's some other shit job that has to be done. And the CSM had got it in his head that this guy was shit jobs. And he kept giving him all the shit jobs because he was the last person in his head that made a mistake. And every time there was something shit that had to be done, he had to do it. And for weeks, he was shit jobs. And then I ended up going to the CSM and I was like, you have to fucking stop this because he has paid his price. But he has been punished. The pressure has to be removed. We have to stop applying this because why would he not do things again? What motivation does he have to not do the same thing again because we didn't remove the pressure? So he's just shit jobs for the rest of his life. That's how he thinks of himself. And he ended up discharging, right? That's learned helplessness because he was like, I tried to do the right thing, but I was still treated like shit. So why would I stick around, right? And he was helpless while he was in the army, and then he found a way to turn off the pressure. What was the way to turn off the pressure? He left. So that's the issue of using negative reinforcement and not turning off the pressure when the behavior happens, is that in the best case, they just become immune to the pressure and no longer perceive it as pressure, it's just life. But in the worst case is that they go, well, there's nothing I can do about it, and they give up trying to find anything, right? It's actually really easy to give learned helplessness. There's a study that they do, it's not a study, it's a demonstration that they do in high schools to teach kids about bullying and how it can affect them. But what they do is, an anagram, like where it's like a word that's all mixed up and you got to find the word in it. So you get a classroom and you hand out 3 pieces of paper to everybody. And we say, okay, this is an anagram. We've all got the same ones. We're going to turn it over. When I say go, we're going to turn it over. The moment you solve it, put your hand in the air. So we say go. Within a few seconds, half the room have got their hand in the air. Got it, right? And the other half are looking around like, shit. And then we say to everybody, don't worry, we're kind of out of time. It should have been a really easy one. Put that one aside. You guys will do better on the second one. And we say, ready, go, and turn it over. And very quickly, half the students have their hand in the air, the same half, right? And the rest of them are looking around going, what the fuck? Well, it turns out there's 2 different tests that got handed out. One that's incredibly easy, like it's like cat, and the other one is unsolvable. It's not just harder, there is no word that can be made from it. And by the 3rd rep of each one, they all have the same test. And what do you think happens on the 3rd rep? The kids that had the easy ones to start with solve the third one in the same amount of time. And the kids that had the unsolvable one don't solve the easy one the third time around because they think of themselves as a person who cannot solve the anagram, right? And so even though it's super easy to solve this time, they just like, I got 2 wrong, everybody else got it right so easily, why even bother? I am just a person who can't do these things. So that's how quickly you can crush someone, right? And it's the same with dogs when you leave them too long without reinforcement. If you're doing any kind of shaping, that's another way you can create learned helplessness, is when they try a bunch of stuff and they're like, fuck, I can't figure it out, I'll just give up. So even though it's positive reinforcement that we would say we're shaping with, the pressure of trying to solve it is what we then put into the category of negative reinforcement. And the pressure of trying to solve it, remember what we talked about how, where did I put my thing? How pressure is cumulative over time, right? So like even if it's a low level of pressure, if this is intensity and this is time, even if it's a low level, if it goes for a long time, that's a lot of duration of pressure that's in there. And so whether that's pressure that we're physically going to apply to the dog, or it's the pressure of trying to solve a puzzle, you have to be careful of duration and how its effects on intensity, right? Leaving a dog under negative reinforcement of the pressure of trying to solve something can be really damaging for a long period of time. That's why we go incremental reps before they give up. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? When we start doing this kind of stuff, when I start implementing it, when I start using negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement, there's a behavior that I want to see, and that behavior is arousal. Because it's kind of impossible to like use one and the other, because in order for, like if you're going to just say like, I'm going to use the prong and then I'm going to like pay, like we did with that golden, right? It looks like we're just using a bit of negative and a bit of positive, but something is being built in the middle here. Something is being reinforced. Something is being created and something is being made more likely to happen. And what I want to see from today is that that is some sort of intensity, right? Now, in some instances, the behavior, like they will be different, because from your dog, I want to see a huge escalation, but from your dog, I want to see a decrease, right? Because the behavior for him will be calmness and the behavior for him will be intensity, right? And I want to just see the play, or like whatever it is that you do, moving around, getting whatever, where the dog is learning, I turn off something. I don't care what it is, right? You use whatever tools you're going to use, and it's being reinforced for that space in the middle there. Once we have those tools, and the dog starts learning, this one pushes me, this one reinforces me, this one like pulls me essentially, then we can start putting a behavior that we want in the middle there. But there's the side effect of having done it without worrying about a behavior like a physical thing that the dog's doing and just going for an attitude. That's essentially what we're going to build, is the attitude that we want in this space here. Is that then when we start teaching this as to being an actual behavior that we want, like a sit, right? The attitude that this drives will go into that behavior. And that's our goal. Now, the attitude that we want is different for every dog, okay? So it's not necessarily that we're always looking to build. It might be that we're looking to calm.